The rain began falling just as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the highway into a slick ribbon of uncertainty. Melanie tightened her grip on the steering wheel, cursing her decision to take the back roads. She had always hated driving in the rain, but this stretch of lonely highway seemed particularly menacing, the dense forest pressing in on either side. Her gas gauge blinked insistently, warning her that she was nearly out of fuel. Melanie groaned, scanning the roadside for any sign of civilization. That's when she saw him, a lone figure standing on the shoulder, drenched to the bone, his thumb jutting out into the darkness. She hesitated, her instincts warring with her conscience. Picking up a hitchhiker was something she'd never done before, but leaving someone stranded in this weather felt cruel. As she slowed to a stop, the figure approached, his face obscured by the rain and the hood of his jacket. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice deep but polite. He slid into the passenger seat, water pooling on the mat beneath him. "I really appreciate it. Been walking for hours." "No problem," Melanie replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" He hesitated, his face partially illuminated by the dim dashboard light. "Just up the road a bit. Anywhere's better than out here." They drove in silence for a while. The only sounds the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. Melanie stole glances at him, noting his unkempt appearance and the way he kept his hands buried in his jacket pockets. Something about him made her uneasy, but she chalked it up to her nerves. After all, the man was soaking wet and probably freezing. "So where were you coming from?" she asked, trying to break the tension. "Nowhere important," he replied curtly, staring straight ahead. The uneasy silence returned, heavier this time. The rain intensified, and Melanie squinted at the road, her grip on the wheel tightening. She regretted stopping now, her imagination running wild with every shadow that flickered at the edge of the headlights. Suddenly, the man shifted in his seat. "You don't trust me, do you?" he asked, his tone unreadable. Melanie's heart skipped a beat. "What? No, I don't usually pick up strangers, that's all." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Smart. You never know who you're letting into your car." Her pulse quickened, and she regretted engaging him at all. As if sensing her discomfort, he turned to face her fully for the first time. His eyes were dark, piercing, and seemed to hold a strange, almost predatory glint. "Relax," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I'm just messing with you." Melanie forced a nervous laugh, but her stomach churned. The gas station appeared up ahead, its flickering neon sign a beacon of relief. She pulled in, parking near the pumps. "I'm going to fill up," she said, eager to get out of the car. "You can wait here." He nodded, leaning back in his seat as she stepped into the downpour. The cold rain was a shock, but she welcomed it, using the moment alone to calm her fraying nerves. She swiped her card, glancing back at the car. The man was still inside, his face unreadable through the rain-streaked window. As the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, Melanie hesitated. She didn't want to get back in the car, but leaving him here felt dangerous in its own way. Gathering her courage, she returned to the driver's seat, her damp hair clinging to her face. "All set," she said, trying to sound casual. But he didn't respond. Instead, he was staring at something outside the car, his expression suddenly alert. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Thought I saw someone," he muttered, his tone different now, serious, almost afraid. Melanie followed his gaze, but the rain and darkness made it impossible to see anything. Her nerves were on edge as she pulled out of the station, her headlights cutting through the storm. The man seemed restless, shifting in his seat and glancing over his shoulder. "Do you mind if I—" The words died in her throat as the car lurched violently to one side. She slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt. Her heart pounded as she realized the back tire had blown. "Great," she muttered, gripping the wheel. The man sat motionless, his gaze fixed ahead. "You should stay in the car." "What? I needed to check the tire." "I said stay in the car," he repeated, his voice low and firm. Something about his tone made her obey, her hand freezing on the door handle. Moments later, a figure emerged from the trees, silhouetted against the headlights. Melanie's breath caught as a second man approached the driver's side, his face partially obscured by a scarf. "You've got a flat," the stranger said, his voice muffled by the rain. Melanie's instincts screamed at her to lock the doors. But before she could react, the hitchhiker leaned across her, pressing the lock button with one hand while reaching into his jacket with the other. "You picked the wrong car," he growled, his voice ice-cold. The second man froze, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the hitchhiker. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, the stranger backed away, disappearing into the storm. The hitchhiker exhaled slowly, his hand slipping out of his jacket to reveal a glint of metal, a knife. "Drive," he said, his voice steady but urgent. Melanie didn't argue. She sped off, her hands shaking on the wheel. After several miles, he spoke again, his tone softer now. "Sorry if I scared you," he said. "But trust me, you don't want to know what would have happened if you'd gotten out." When they reached a populated area, the hitchhiker instructed her to pull over. Without another word, he stepped out and disappeared into the night. Melanie never picked up another hitchhiker again. The highway stretched endlessly before her, illuminated only by the twin beams of her headlights. Jessica hated driving alone at night, but she was hours behind schedule and eager to make it to her sister's house before dawn. Her favorite true crime podcast played softly in the background, a faint comfort in the oppressive quiet. That's when she saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, his arm outstretched, thumb pointed upward. His clothes were tattered, and he looked utterly soaked, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a low-hanging tree branch. Jessica's foot hovered over the brake. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to keep driving, but something about the man's posture seemed desperate. Against her better judgment, she slowed to a stop. The man jogged to the passenger side and opened the door, the overhead light casting his features into sharp relief. He was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, but his smile was wide and surprisingly warm. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy but polite. "Been out here all night." "No problem," Jessica lied, her pulse racing as he climbed in and settled into the seat. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," he replied, closing the door. He glanced at her with an expression that was hard to read. "I won't take up too much of your time." Jessica nodded, forcing herself to focus on the road. The man didn't seem threatening, but her unease grew with every passing mile. His presence was heavy, like a dark cloud had settled inside the car. He stared out the window in silence, his hands resting loosely on his lap. After several minutes, Jessica cleared her throat. So, what were you doing out there?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Waiting." "For what?" she asked, regretting the question the moment it left her lips. "For you." Her grip tightened on the steering wheel, her heart hammering in her chest. She forced a nervous laugh. "That's a little creepy." "I don't mean it like that," he said, his tone calm. "I just knew someone would come along eventually." The silence stretched out again, thicker this time. Jessica glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He was staring at her now, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" she asked, desperate to fill the void. He hesitated. "Does it matter?" Jessica's skin prickled. She reached over to turn up the volume on her podcast, but the man's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Don't," he said, his voice low and firm. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. His hand was ice cold, his grip unyielding. Slowly he released her, settling back into his seat. "Sorry," he muttered. "I just don't like noise." Jessica nodded, her heart racing. She turned the podcast off completely, the car now filled with an eerie silence broken only by the hum of the tires on the pavement. After what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again. "You shouldn't have stopped for me." "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're too trusting," he said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "You never know who you're letting into your car." Jessica swallowed hard, her palms slick with sweat. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, willing the time to pass faster. "You can drop me off here," he said abruptly, pointing to a dimly lit rest area up ahead. Relieved, Jessica pulled into the parking lot and stopped the car. The man opened the door but hesitated, turning to face her one last time. "Be careful out there," he said, his voice tinged with an odd sadness. "Not everyone you meet has good intentions." And with that, he stepped out, disappearing into the shadows. Jessica sat there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She reached over to lock the passenger door and was about to drive off when she noticed something lying on the seat. It was a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, she picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "He's still out there. Don't stop again." Her blood turned to ice as she realized what he meant. She glanced into her rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the rest area, partially obscured by the trees. But it wasn't the hitchhiker. It was someone else, someone watching her. The desert highway was eerily quiet. The only sounds the hum of Mia's engine and the faint whistle of wind against her windows. She had been driving for hours, the vast emptiness around her broken only by the occasional cactus or weathered signpost. Her phone had no signal, and the gas gauge was dangerously close to empty. She cursed herself for not filling up earlier, but clung to the hope that a station would appear soon. That's when she saw him. A man standing by the side of the road, waving one arm desperately. He wore a faded denim jacket, his hair wild and unkempt. As her car approached, he stepped forward, forcing her to slow down. Mia's gut screamed at her to keep driving, but the look of panic on his face made her hesitate. She rolled down her window a few inches. "What's wrong?" she called out. "Thank God you stopped," the man said, breathless. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a lift to the nearest station?" Mia hesitated, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He didn't seem dangerous, but the isolation made her wary. After a moment, she nodded. "Fine, but just to the next station." "Thank you," he said, climbing into the passenger seat. The door shut with a heavy thud, sealing the two of them into the tight space. As they drove, the man introduced himself as Caleb. He seemed friendly enough, cracking jokes about his bad luck and the heat of the desert. Mia relaxed slightly, though she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Then Caleb shifted in his seat, glancing into the rearview mirror. His face darkened. "Don't freak out," he said quietly, "but I think someone's following us." Mia's stomach dropped. She glanced in the mirror and saw nothing but the dark expanse of road behind them. "What are you talking about?" "I saw a car," he insisted, "back there by the bend in the road. It was parked, but I swear it started moving when we passed." Mia tried to laugh it off, but her pulse quickened. "There's no one out here. You're imagining things." "Maybe," he muttered, but his eyes remained fixed on the mirror. The miles stretched on, the tension in the car thickening with every second. Just as Mia began to think Caleb was paranoid, her headlights caught something ahead. A dark shape sprawled across the road. She slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just feet from what appeared to be a pile of debris. "Stay here," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "What? No." Caleb grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Don't get out. I need to move it, or we're not going anywhere," Mia snapped, yanking her arm free. She stepped out into the cool desert night, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. The debris was a strange mix of branches and clothes. Her heart raced as she realized the arrangement looked deliberate, like someone had placed it there. A sound behind her made her spin around. Caleb was standing by the car, his face pale. "We need to go," he said, his voice trembling. "Why?" Mia asked, her gaze darting to the empty road. "They're watching us," he whispered, pointing toward the darkness beyond the headlights. Mia followed his finger, her eyes straining against the shadows. At first, she saw nothing, but then movement. A figure emerged from the darkness, followed by another and another. They stood silently at the edge of the light, their features obscured, but their intent clear. Panic surged through Mia as she bolted back to the car. Caleb was already inside, shouting for her to drive. She threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning against the gravel before they gained traction. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching as the car sped away. Mia's hands trembled on the wheel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Caleb was muttering under his breath, something about traps and not the first time. She didn't ask for clarification. She just wanted to get out of there. When they finally reached a gas station, it was lit up like a beacon in the darkness. Caleb jumped out, muttering a quick thanks before disappearing into the building. Mia stayed in the car, too shaken to move. She glanced into the rearview mirror again. The road behind her was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. A few minutes later, Caleb emerged from the station, but something was wrong. His walk was slow, deliberate, and he was looking over his shoulder as if someone or something was behind him. He climbed back into the car, his face ashen. "They're here," he whispered. Mia didn't ask who. She didn't want to know. She just floored the gas pedal, praying the road ahead would lead them somewhere safe. The moon hung low over the desolate highway, casting its cold light over the asphalt. Erin had been driving for hours, her eyelids heavy, the radio crackling with static. She regretted taking the scenic route now. The long stretches of nothingness made her feel like she was the last person on Earth. She yawned, glancing at the clock. 2:37 a.m. She had miles to go before she'd find a motel, and her gas tank was dangerously low. Her headlights caught a figure up ahead, standing by the side of the road. A hitchhiker. Her heart sank. A lone man, dressed in dark clothing, his thumbs sticking out as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Erin's instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but guilt tugged at her. It was cold out, and he could be in real trouble. She slowed the car and rolled down her window, keeping her hand on the lock button. "Need a ride?" she asked cautiously. "Yeah, thank you," he said, his voice gravelly but polite. He opened the passenger door and slid in, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Where are you headed?" Erin asked, pulling back onto the road. "Just up ahead," he said vaguely, his eyes fixed on the empty horizon. "Not far." She nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. The man smelled faintly of dirt and something metallic. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers long and bony, the nails stained with grime. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine the only sound. Erin tried not to look at him, but her unease grew with every passing mile. She felt his gaze on her, heavy and invasive, though he never turned his head. "You traveling alone?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Erin's stomach tightened. "My husband's meeting me at the next stop," she lied. "We're on a road trip." The hitchhiker chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said firmly, her voice shaking. "He's probably wondering where I am right now." The man didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward, fiddling with the dial on the radio. Static filled the car, followed by snippets of a voice, a news broadcast. "A dangerous fugitive escaped from custody earlier tonight. Authorities warn he is armed and extremely dangerous." Erin's blood ran cold. She darted a glance at the man, who was now sitting back in his seat, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice almost playful. "And nothing," she stammered, her pulse racing. She focused on the road, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. "Turn here," he said suddenly, pointing to a narrow dirt road that veered off into the darkness. "I don't think. Turn," he snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. Heart pounding, Erin obeyed. The road was rough, the car jostling as it navigated the uneven terrain. Trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. "Stop here," the man commanded after a few minutes. Erin did as he said, her hands trembling. He opened the door and stepped out, gesturing for her to follow. "Come on," he said. "I need your help with something." "I'd rather stay here," Erin replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man leaned back into the car, his face inches from hers. His eyes were dark, hollow, and filled with something she couldn't name but instinctively feared. "I wasn't asking," he said. Erin's breath hitched. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of damp earth. He led her into the trees, the ground soft and uneven beneath her sneakers. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Finally, they stopped in a small clearing. What do you need help with?" she whispered. The man turned to her, his smile wide and cruel. "Dig." He pointed to the ground, where a rusted shovel lay next to a shallow hole. The moonlight glinted off something protruding from the dirt, something pale and human-shaped. Erin stumbled back, shaking her head. "I'm not doing this," she said, her voice rising. The man stepped closer, pulling a knife from his pocket. The blade was long and jagged, glinting menacingly in the light. "You'll dig," he said, "or you'll join them." Tears streamed down Erin's face as she grabbed the shovel, her mind racing for a way out. She couldn't outrun him, not here, not in the dark. As she started to dig, the hitchhiker watched her, his knife held loosely at his side. His grin never faltered. But then a sound broke through the silence, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. Headlights flickered through the trees, growing brighter by the second. The hitchhiker's expression darkened. "Don't you dare!" Erin didn't let him finish. She dropped the shovel and bolted toward the road, screaming at the top of her lungs. The approaching car screeched to a halt, and its driver, a burly trucker, jumped out. "What's going on?" he shouted. Erin didn't stop to explain. She grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the clearing, but when they arrived, the hitchhiker was gone. All that remained was the shallow hole and the pale, lifeless hand reaching out of the dirt. The road stretched like a black ribbon through the wilderness, with no streetlights, and only the faint glow of a crescent moon to break the darkness. Clara was exhausted, her eyes heavy as the rhythmic hum of the tires threatened to lull her to sleep. She'd been on the road for hours, the promise of a cheap motel at the next town the only thing keeping her going. Her headlights cut through the darkness, and she spotted him, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Clara slammed on the brakes, her car screeching to a halt just feet from the man. He didn't flinch. He stood there, motionless, staring at her car. Clara's heart pounded as she fumbled to lock her doors. The man stepped closer, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes tattered and soaked. His eyes, shadowed and empty, seemed to pierce through the windshield. She rolled down her window just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I need a ride," he said flatly, his voice hollow. Clara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to drive away, but she couldn't bring herself to leave him there in the dark. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the passenger door. "Thank you," he muttered, climbing in. He smelled of damp earth, his presence heavy and oppressive. As they drove, the man said little, staring straight ahead as if lost in thought. Clara tried to make conversation to ease the tension. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Nowhere far," he replied. His tone was cold, almost robotic. "Just down the road." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, noticing how stiffly he sat, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his lips barely moved when he spoke. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Clara forced a nervous laugh. "Yeah, I know. Long drive." "You don't understand," he said, his tone sharpening. "It's dangerous." Her grip tightened on the wheel. "Why? What's out here?" He turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Him." Clara's stomach twisted. "Him who?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the road ahead. "Turn here." She frowned, seeing nothing but a dirt path leading into the trees. "Are you sure? That doesn't look like a—" "Turn here," he said again, his voice low and commanding. Clara reluctantly obeyed, her car bumping along the uneven path. The woods seemed to close in around them, the darkness thick and suffocating. She glanced at the man, her unease growing by the second. "Why are we going this way?" she asked, her voice quivering. "To avoid him," he replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Clara's hands shook as she navigated the twisting path. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. She was about to demand answers when the car suddenly sputtered and died, plunging them into stillness. "What the hell?" she muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine wouldn't start. "He's here," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Clara snapped, her fear boiling over into anger. The man turned to her, his face now unnervingly calm. "You shouldn't have picked me up." Before Clara could respond, something slammed against the side of the car, rocking it violently. She screamed, her eyes darting to the window, but the darkness outside revealed nothing. "Lock the doors," the man shouted, his earlier monotone replaced with panic. Clara frantically hit the lock button, her breathing ragged. The car rocked again, the sound of scraping metal sending chills down her spine. She could hear it now, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the vehicle. "What is that?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's found us," the man said, his voice trembling. A face appeared at the driver's side window, a pale, grinning visage with hollow eyes and teeth too sharp to be human. Clara screamed as the thing pressed its hands against the glass, its nails dragging down with an ear-piercing screech. "Don't look at him," the man yelled, grabbing her arm. "Whatever you do, don't look." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her body shaking as the creature circled the car, tapping on the windows, its laughter a guttural, inhuman sound. She felt the man's grip tighten on her arm. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I led him to you." "What are you talking about?" she cried, her voice cracking. Before he could answer, the passenger door flew open. The man was yanked out with a force that made the car lurch. His screams were brief, cut off by a sickening crunch. Clara sat frozen, her eyes squeezed shut, the silence deafening now. She didn't dare move, her mind racing as tears streamed down her face. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. When she finally opened her eyes, the man was gone. So was the creature. Her car started on the first try, the headlights flickering to life. She drove back to the main road as fast as she could, her hands shaking so badly she could barely keep the wheel steady. She didn't stop driving until she reached the next town, where she collapsed in the parking lot of a brightly lit diner. She never drove at night again, and she never stopped for strangers. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the windshield as Ben navigated the winding back roads of rural Pennsylvania. His GPS had rerouted him after an accident on the main highway, and now he was hopelessly lost in a maze of unlit streets. The clock on the dashboard read 1:14 a.m. Ben squinted through the downpour when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a stop. The figure didn't move, standing there in the rain, shoulders slumped, head hanging low. Ben hesitated. Every nerve in his body told him to drive around and keep going, but what if they were hurt? He reluctantly rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond at first. Then it slowly lifted its head, revealing a young woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with a strange, haunted expression. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I need help." Ben sighed, unlocking the passenger door. "Get in." She climbed in without a word, water pooling on the seat beneath her. Her hair was matted, her clothes drenched, and she clutched a small backpack to her chest as if it were her lifeline. "Where are you headed?" Ben asked, his voice cautious. "Just down the road," she said, not meeting his gaze. Ben frowned but didn't press her. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. As they drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. She sat perfectly still, her hands gripping the backpack tightly, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "What were you doing out there?" he asked finally. She hesitated before answering. "Walking. In the middle of nowhere? At this hour? In the rain?" She turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were dark, almost too dark, and filled with an intensity that made Ben's stomach twist. "I didn't have a choice." Ben nodded awkwardly, not knowing how to respond. He focused on the road, hoping the awkward ride would end soon. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her tense up. Her breathing quickened, and she clutched the backpack even tighter. "What's wrong?" he asked, glancing at her. "He's coming," she whispered. Ben's grip tightened on the wheel. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and stared out the rear windshield. Her lips moved silently, mouthing something Ben couldn't hear. He followed her gaze into the rearview mirror and froze. There was something in the distance. A pair of headlights, faint but unmistakable, appeared far behind them. The road had been deserted for miles, but now someone was following them. "Is that someone you know?" Ben asked, his voice laced with unease. Her head snapped toward him, her expression frantic. "You have to drive faster." Ben pressed the accelerator, the car picking up speed. The headlights behind them grew brighter, closer. He could now make out the outline of a large black truck. "Why are they following us?" Ben demanded. "They're not after you," she said, her voice trembling. "They're after me." "What the hell does that mean?" Before she could answer, the truck behind them surged forward, closing the gap between the vehicles. Its headlights flooded the interior of Ben's car, blindingly bright. The roar of its engine was deafening as it inched closer, nearly grazing the bumper. Ben's panic skyrocketed. "Hold on," he yelled, swerving wildly as the truck rammed into them. The woman screamed, clutching the dashboard as the car fishtailed on the slick road. "Get off the main road," she cried. "Take the next turn." Ben barely saw the narrow dirt path veering off to the right, but he turned sharply, the tires skidding in the mud. The truck didn't follow. Instead, it stopped at the entrance to the path, its headlights cutting off abruptly, plunging them into darkness. Ben's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. The woman didn't answer. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Finally, she whispered, "He doesn't stop." "What do you mean? He doesn't stop?" Ben demanded. "Who is he?" She opened her backpack and pulled out a tattered photograph. It showed a man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile standing in front of the same black truck. "I ran from him," she said, "and I've been running ever since." Ben stared at the photo, a chill running down his spine. "Why is he after you?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because I got away, and he doesn't like loose ends." Before Ben could respond, the roar of the truck's engine shattered the silence. Its headlights flicked on, now at the end of the path, blocking their exit. "He found us," the woman whispered. The truck surged forward, barreling down the narrow path straight toward them. Ben threw the car into reverse, but the wheels spun uselessly in the mud. The woman grabbed his arm, her voice a frantic scream. "Run!" Ben didn't think twice. He yanked the door open and bolted into the woods, the woman close behind. The truck's headlights lit up the trees, the sound of its engine growing louder as it plowed forward. Branches whipped at Ben's face as he ran, his lungs burning, the woman's panicked sobs echoing in his ears. The sound of the truck didn't fade. It followed, relentless, tearing through the underbrush like a predator hunting its prey. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. Ben turned back, his chest heaving, but the truck was gone. The woman collapsed to her knees, clutching her backpack. "Is it over?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He never stops." Ben didn't wait to find out what that meant. He ran, leaving the woman behind, her cries swallowed by the darkness. And as he fled, he couldn't shake the feeling that the headlights would find him next. The sky was a deep, oppressive black as Jared drove down the lonely stretch of highway. His job required late-night shifts, but this was the first time he'd been on this particular route. The GPS assured him it was the fastest way home, but it felt like he was driving into a void. No other cars, no streetlights, just the eerie glow of his headlights cutting through the dark. A sign loomed out of the darkness. Next gas, 50 miles. Jared glanced at his fuel gauge and cursed under his breath. It hovered just above empty. He'd have to stop at the next station, or he'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. 10 minutes later, a faint light appeared in the distance. Jared sighed with relief as a small gas station emerged from the shadows, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. The sign buzzed faintly, one letter flickering on and off. He pulled up to the pump and got out. The air was unnaturally still, and the only sound was the faint creak of the metal sign swinging in the breeze. Jared walked to the pump, inserted his card, and waited. The screen remained blank. "Great," he muttered. "Need some help?" a voice said, startling him. Jared spun around to see an older man standing in the doorway of the station. He was wiry, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to glint too brightly in the dim light. Yeah," Jared said, forcing a polite smile. "The pump's not working." The man gestured for him to come inside. "Card reader's been busted for years. You'll have to pay cash." Jared hesitated, but then nodded, following the man into the station. Inside, the air was heavy, smelling of dust and old oil. Shelves lined with faded candy bars and expired chips filled the small space. The man stood behind the counter, watching Jared intently as he pulled a few bills from his wallet. "Where you headed?" the man asked, his tone casual but his gaze unnerving. "Just passing through," Jared said quickly, handing over the money. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jared's face. "Be careful out there," Jared frowned. "Why?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slid Jared's change across the counter and turned away, disappearing into a back room without another word. Uneasy, Jared left the station and began pumping gas as fast as he could. As he finished, he noticed something strange. Across the road, just beyond the station, was a figure standing in the shadows. Jared froze. The figure was tall and motionless, its face obscured by the darkness. "Hey!" Jared called, trying to sound braver than he felt. "You okay?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Jared's pulse quickened. He finished pumping, jumped into his car, and locked the doors. He glanced at the figure one last time before speeding away. The road stretched on, the gas station quickly disappearing from view. Jared shook his head, trying to laugh off his nerves. "Just some weirdo," he muttered to himself. But then he saw it. In the rearview mirror, a shape appeared on the road behind him. At first, it was distant, just a smudge of darkness against the headlights, but it was moving fast, too fast. Jared's grip on the wheel tightened as the shape grew larger, resolving into the figure he'd seen by the gas station. It was running, chasing him. Jared slammed on the accelerator, his car roaring as it sped down the empty highway. The figure didn't fall behind. Instead, it seemed to be gaining on him, its long limbs moving unnaturally, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Jesus Christ," Jared whispered, his heart pounding. He glanced at the speedometer, 90 miles per hour, and the figure was still there, keeping pace. Suddenly, it wasn't behind him anymore. It was alongside the car. Jared's breath hitched as he turned his head. The figure was right outside his window, its face pressed against the glass. It had no eyes, just black, hollow sockets and a wide, toothless grin that stretched impossibly far. Its bony fingers scratched at the window, leaving streaks in the condensation. Jared screamed and jerked the wheel, the car swerving violently. He lost control, the vehicle spinning out before crashing into the ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of him. Dazed, he fumbled with his seatbelt and stumbled out of the car. The highway was silent again, the figure nowhere in sight. Jared's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. He turned back to his car, hoping it was still drivable, when he heard it. A soft, wet laugh. It came from the trees lining the highway, low and guttural, echoing in the darkness. Jared backed away, his eyes darting frantically. Then, stepping out of the shadows, was the figure. Its grin was wider now, its head tilting unnaturally as it walked toward him. Jared turned and ran, the sound of its laughter chasing him into the night. The stretch of Route 17 was infamous among truckers and travelers alike, a desolate road cutting through dense forests with no towns or rest stops for miles. They called it the Devil's Spine for reasons no one could quite agree on. Some said it was the sharp turns that sent cars hurtling into ravines. Others whispered about disappearances, strange lights, or shadowy figures that appeared in the rearview mirrors. Paul didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a long-haul trucker with 15 years under his belt, and the only thing he feared on the road was a bad axle or running out of coffee. But as he drove into the thick blackness of Route 17 that night, even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His headlights carved through the fog, illuminating the empty road ahead. The CB radio crackled occasionally, but it was mostly static. No chatter from other truckers tonight. Paul hummed along to the faint country music playing on his dashboard, trying to ignore the oppressive silence outside. Then he saw her, a figure on the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. A woman, waving her arms desperately, her white dress glowing faintly in the headlights. Paul slowed, cursing under his breath. The last thing he needed was a hitchhiker, but he couldn't just leave her out here in the middle of nowhere. He rolled down the window as he approached. "You all right, miss?" The woman stepped closer, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to get out of here." Paul sighed and unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in." She climbed up into the cab, her movements stiff and jerky. She clutched a small handbag, her knuckles white. Paul noticed she was barefoot, her dress stained with dirt and streaks of something dark. "Where are you headed?" he asked as the truck rumbled back onto the road. "Just away," she whispered, staring straight ahead. Her hands trembled in her lap. Paul frowned. "What happened? Car breakdown?" The woman didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the windshield, her breathing shallow and rapid. Paul decided not to push her. He'd drop her at the nearest gas station or motel and let someone else deal with whatever drama she was running from. But after a few miles of silence, she spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped." Paul glanced at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "They'll follow us now," she said, her voice barely audible. Paul felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who's they?" She didn't respond. Instead, she pointed to the side mirror. "Look." Paul hesitated before glancing at the mirror. At first, he saw nothing but the empty road behind them. But then, movement. Small, flickering shapes darting in and out of the fog. It looked like people running fast, too fast. "What the hell?" Paul muttered, pressing the accelerator. The truck growled as it picked up speed, but the figures didn't fall behind. They were closer now, their outlines sharp in the red glow of the taillights. Paul's hands tightened on the wheel. "Who are they? What do they want?" The woman turned to him, her face pale as death. "They want me. And now they'll want you too." Paul's stomach dropped. He stared at the road ahead, his heart pounding as the truck hurtled through the darkness. The figures weren't just running anymore, they were climbing. He heard the thud of feet on the back of the trailer, the scrape of nails on metal. "Jesus Christ," Paul whispered, glancing at the rearview mirror. A face appeared, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face with a wide, unnatural grin pressed against the glass. Paul swerved, trying to shake them off, but the truck was too heavy, too unwieldy. The woman clutched the dashboard, her voice rising in a panic chant. "You can't stop," she said. "Whatever you do, don't stop." The figures climbed higher, their laughter echoing through the cab. One of them slammed a hand against the side window, leaving a smear of something dark and viscous. Paul gritted his teeth and floored the accelerator. Suddenly, the woman screamed. "Turn off your lights!" "What?" "Do it!" she shrieked, her voice breaking. "Turn them off now!" Paul hesitated but reached for the switch, plunging the truck into darkness. The road disappeared, the cab lit only by the faint glow of the dashboard. The laughter outside faltered, then stopped. Paul held his breath, his knuckles white on the wheel. The truck roared forward, blind and deaf to the world outside. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figures were gone. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the fog began to clear. Paul slowed the truck, his hands shaking. He turned to the woman, but her seat was empty. The passenger door was still locked. The cab was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Paul stared at the empty seat, his mind racing. He pulled the truck over, heart pounding, and threw open the door. There was no sign of her, no sign of anyone. Paul climbed back into the cab and drove the rest of Route 17 with his lights on, but the road stayed empty. When he finally reached the next town, he told the other truckers what had happened. They all gave him the same grim look. "She was one of them," one man said, shaking his head. "You're lucky you made it out." Paul didn't argue. He never drove Route 17 again, and he never ever stopped for hitchhikers.